if that sounds good to everyone. So my name is Kirsten Monroe, and I'm the associate editor of Science and Society. Founded in 1936, Science and Society is the longest continually publishing Marxist scholarly journal in any language anywhere in the world, and was the first to appear in English. Since its founding, Science and Society has been proudly independent and non-sectarian. If you enjoyed today's event, I would like to encourage you to please subscribe to Science and Society, to encourage your university library to subscribe, and of course, to think of Science and Society as a possible destination for your work. The topic for today's panel is technology, automation, and socialist strategy. Aaron Benanav is a researcher. Is a researcher at Humboldt University of Berlin and author of Automation and the Future of Work. Gavin Mueller is a lecturer in new media and digital culture at the University of Amsterdam and author of Breaking Things at Work, The Luddites Are Right About Why You Hate Your Job. Jason E. Smith is associate professor in the graduate art department at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California, and the author of Smart Machines and Service Work, Automation in the Age of Stagnation. And so what we're going to do for today is each of our speakers is going to speak for 15 minutes, and then we will open it up to discussion and questions. And also, I'd like to say welcome to those of you live streaming. If anyone is there, please feel free to live tweet the event and tag hashtag S&S-April and at SciSoc Journal on Twitter. So with that, I think maybe we'll go in alphabetical order with our speakers and begin with Aaron. Great. Oh, and thank you so much to our speakers. This is a really exciting event.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to briefly go through the subject of the book. So Automation and the Future of Work draws on material from my dissertation, as well as work I've done in EndNotes, and to intervene into a kind of contemporary discourse around what's going on with work today and what the future of work is. So in the book, I talk about a set of kind of ideas and theories that are kind of moving through the media spaces that I call the automation discourse, that really starts from the premise, look around, we already see all of these people are losing their jobs to machines. This is the start of a really qualitative transformation in work that's starting right now. That's going to eventually mean that everyone loses their job. That could be an amazing, point 3 is that could be an amazing transformation for humanity, except that most people depend on having a job in order to live. And then point 4 is that the way to turn this jobs apocalypse nightmare into a beautiful utopian future is to implement a universal basic income. So in the book, I talk about those 4 points and why I think that they are misplaced. And I offer a kind of alternative account of the material that the automation theorists or automation discourse is pointing towards. Part of why I do this is that I think it's actually the automation discourse today is a really important utopian discourse. And it's really interesting that people involved in circles of thinking about automation have really proposed ideas about what it would mean to live in a world where work wasn't at the center of people's identities, in which, social life could kind of promote human flourishing in a new way. And I find those utopian dimensions of the automation discourse particularly interesting. What I think that the automation theorists really get right in their account is that they stress that the main driving problem in the world today is a radical under-demand for labor, persistent under-demand for labor, that at the kind of heart of a lot of political kind of tensions today, and struggles that are going on, at the heart of rising inequality is this problem that workers need to work and are having trouble finding it. And that's giving rise to all of these kind of related problems of people finding jobs that underemploy them, that workers are really subordinated to the kinds of investment decisions employers are making. They don't have much say in their work. And and that their incomes are stagnating and so on. So what the automation discourse gets right is this story about the real problem in our society being a low demand for labor. What they get wrong, unfortunately, is that they say that the reason for this low demand for labor is that technology is having this kind of qualitative breakthrough moment, that we're shifting into a new plane with AI and advanced robotics and machine learning, and that's really the source of this radically low demand for labor. So in the book, I give an alternative account that is in a lot of ways grounded in my dissertation and by extension, the work of Robert Brenner, who was my advisor, that really the core story that we need to tell here is one of a kind of long-term stagnation process in capitalist economies that's grounded in industrial overcapacity in world markets. That basically, after a long period of growth during the long boom of the 50s and 60s, so many countries were developing technological and productive capacities, and frontier technologies were escaping from the US and Northern Europe to other parts of the world. And it created such an overcrowded world market that it pushed down profit rates, lowered rates of investment, and caused deindustrialization, which has been happening not only in the core wealthy countries, but also in developing countries. And in fact, according to the UN, deindustrialization is now a global phenomenon for about a decade. I marry to the Brenner overcapacity story, a story about why services have not been able to replace manufacturing as a growth engine, so that capitalist economies, since they face industrial overcapacity, have really been running down at the level of the economy as a whole. And the result of this stagnation tendency in the wider economy, which doesn't mean that countries aren't still able to grow quickly, like China, of course, in this period, but China's growth, China was able to obtain such high growth rates, I say, because they're able to take market share away from other countries. So in a slow growing international economic environment, the only way to grow quickly is to make other countries' situation substantially worse. And so in this context of overwhelming stagnation that's been going on now for half a century, workers have increasingly been forced to take jobs that underemploy them. That the real story here is not, and I show this with a wealth of statistics, which I'm not presenting here in any kind of PowerPoint, but the basic key to the story is to show that especially in manufacturing, but also in services and in the economy as a whole, we just don't see the tendency that the automation theorists identify. That is to say, we don't see an increase in rates of productivity growth, which is what we would expect to see if what was going on was a real qualitative shift in technologies and a new incredible wave of brilliant technological transformation. We'd expect that to show up in productivity growth numbers. And what we see instead is that productivity growth rates have been at best stable and probably falling, both in manufacturing and in the wider economy. And that what's really driving, again, this problem for workers of finding jobs is not that jobs are being created at a really fast pace. It's not that jobs are being destroyed at a very rapid pace. It's rather that jobs aren't really being created. So the problem, again, is the stagnation tendency, the fact that jobs are not being created to replace the ones that are lost to productivity growth. And that's really what defines the era we live in. In later parts of the book, I talk about how governments responded to this stagnation tendency in the economy since the 70s, since investment rates declined and unemployment rates rose. They tried to do everything they could to revive the economic growth engine, and that meant rescinding labor protections and spending lots of money, increasing public debt levels. It meant deregulating the economy and really doing everything that they could to try to entice private investors to invest. But because all of the moves that these governments made did not repair or transform the fundamental overriding story of international overcapacity on the one hand in industry and endemically slow productivity growth in services. The overall consequence of this was just to force workers to try to find ways to survive with ever less help and ever worse economic conditions. And in the book, I chart out the ways that workers, as a result, all over the world, not just in the wealthy countries, but all around the world, have increasingly found work in various forms of underemployment in the service sector. And so, so the book goes through that history. It looks at industry, services. It looks at transformations in the labor market institutions and the kinds of underemployment that are affecting workers. And then it turns to the question of solutions. And the basic claim that the book makes is that the solution that's proposed by the automation theorist, UBI, is, of course, a really interesting solution. And there's a lot of reasons to think that it's something we should take seriously. And again, the thing that I like about the UBI proposals is that they have this character of claiming that workers and really everyone in society, that we should have universal benefits, that people should simply have direct access in some way to what they need to live. And that's really important in a country like the United States, where our welfare programs have generally been means tested as a legacy and as a kind of instantiation or expression of the racist character of the country that we live in. And, it's anti-poor, anti-worker character. So opting for universal benefits is really important. But I say the UBI story that the UBI kind of proposals that these automation theorists are making really depend on their story about what's going on in the economy being true. So if it were the case that we lived in an age of brilliant technologies where workers were more and more being pushed out of production, but production itself was expanding at an incredible pace due to, or potentially incredible pace, due to these automation technologies, the problem we would have would be mainly a problem of distribution. It would be a problem of worker getting money into the hands of all of these ex-workers so they could buy what they need to live. In my account, the problem isn't really a problem of distribution, but one of production. It's about the running down of the growth engine. And it therefore requires a solution that really is about at the level of production itself, a transformation in the way we produce, and especially in the way that we deal with the problems of how we invest, how we transform the productive apparatus of the society that we live in. So I talk a bit about UBI, I talk about Keynesian solutions. I point out that, in fact, during the so-called era of Keynesianism, the global boom, countries generally paid down their debts, or at least they didn't accumulate debts as quickly as the economy was growing, so that their debt to GDP ratios were falling. It's really only since the 1970s downturn that countries have begun to radically accumulate over and over long periods, higher and higher levels of debt. And that's because, again, these Keynesian efforts to stimulate the economy have worked to some extent to slow the stagnation process down, but they haven't affected the core cause of that, which again is this global overcapacity story in industry. And so what we've seen is that all of these efforts to entice further investment under that condition haven't really worked. They've slowed down, or they've kind of slowed the crisis tendencies, but they haven't fundamentally changed the game. So at the end of the book, what I suggest is a kind of account of what it would take to break through this stagnation tendency and the kinds of really all of the consequences that it's had for workers. And here I really make use of the utopian vision that the automation theorists have, which is sometimes described as a post-scarcity vision. It's a vision in which there's a technological transformation, and suddenly we live in a world of abundance where, due to these amazing technologies, we can get everything we need without having to work. And I oppose that technological story to an account in which abundance is not a technological overcoming, but a social relationship. And I refer back to thinkers like Karl Marx, but also a whole history of figures going back to Thomas More, Gerard Winstanley, and including Marx, but also Kropotkin and W.B. Du Bois, and all of these other thinkers who've thought not that we need to wait for technology to make it possible for us to achieve post-scarcity, but rather we already can use the technologies we have right now, wherever we happen to be in this story, to radically transform how we distribute work amongst ourselves, to reduce the labor that any one person has to do, to create a world of that's post-scarcity in the sense that people have access to all the things that they need to make a life for themselves without exception, universally. And that overcoming of scarcity in the sense of a deep and abiding insecurity, which is what the term scarcity meant before the neoclassical economists got a hold of it, could be the basis for opening up an expansive realm of freedom for people to be able to pursue their passions, whatever those might be, outside of work. And I've really continued to develop that account. I have an article in Logic magazine about the socialist calculation debate. And again, the point of that text is to say that solutions to the socialist calculation debate that think it's merely about new technologies and coming up with technologies miss the ways in which what we really need to do is not come up with technologies that break us through to a new era, but transform social relationships in a way that allow for that breakthrough to a new kind of humanity to take place. And that's also what I'm continuing to work on now. What I'm really excited about is the idea of a post-scarcity economics and the possibilities for that kind of transformation. Today, in the book as well, I talk a little bit about social struggles as the main engine that could potentially get us to a post-scarcity world. And I really encourage the readers of the book to immerse themselves in those struggles as they're happening today, and to be, agents of pressing those struggles, not merely to be anti-austerity and against all of the horrible impositions of this world, but pushing towards a post-scarcity world, a world in which everyone has direct access to the things that they need to make a life, in which the infrastructures and workplaces of capitalist society have been taken over and transformed, and in which, as a result, everyone works a lot less and has a lot more time to pursue their passions. So I'll stop there and I will pass the mic.
All right, thank you so much, Aaron. The next speaker is Gavin.
Hi, thank you, Kirsten, and thank you everyone in attendance, and also thank you, Aaron, for a really enlightening talk. So my remarks are not quite a summary of the book, but an attempt to kind of have a few sort of speculative threads that I think try to speak a little bit more particularly to the idea of strategy based on current movements. I will say that I live in Europe, but I'm not for very long. I'm American, so those are a lot of my kind of touchstones are from an American context. So that's just a caveat. So my project began with a critique of sort of post-work accelerationism, the idea that technology was kind of eradicating work through automation of the labor process, very similar to Aaron, and that this would lead to a kind of opening of opportunity for socialist politics. I argue that this is wrong in several respects. First, that what we think of as automation is a process, but it's not a process that is getting rid of work necessarily in a straightforward way. Second, that the effects of these technologies, the idea that the effects of the automation technologies are beneficial for socialist politics, I think that's quite questionable. And finally, the idea that that socialism or communism is a kind of is post-work as things like fully automated luxury communism and things like that would have it. I don't think that that is possible, and I also am not sure that it's desirable to get rid of all work or attempt to get rid of all work through automation and other technological applications. So I start off this intervention by revisiting the struggles of the Luddites, who were weavers and other textile workers in the North and Midlands of England and the early 19th century, who in their assaults on gig mills and stocking frames at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution are commonly understood as a kind of futile fight against inevitable technological progress. Instead, I argue that they were kind of conducting a completely rational and in many ways impressive and in some ways effective forms of struggle against capital and the state of their time. These formed what Eric Hobsbawm referred to in an early article as, quote, collective bargaining by riot, were determined by the composition of these workers, who were skilled artisans who often worked independently. As Hobsbawm describes it, orderly and bureaucratic strikes were impossible to organize in such a milieu. So to go to my first point, many forms of automation, I think, are better understood as reorganizing work than eradicating it. And they are reorganizing it in ways that are beneficial to capital accumulation and detrimental to anti-capitalist politics, which I understand comes through kind of autonomous organizing of workers. Automation tends to undermine existing forms of worker organization. And a large part of the book is to go through, to start with the Luddites, but go through the kind of very quickly the history of the workers' movement and moments where technology was kind of politicized in this way. And what I argue is that at various moments, workers are struggling because automation is undermining existing forms of worker organization. Sometimes this means actual formal organizations, right, such as trade unions. The Marxist theoretician Raya Dunayevskaya at one point is analyzing the introduction of the continuous miner, or what a machine that miners referred to as the man killer. She notes that John L. Lewis, who's the head of the United Mine Workers of America, the big trade union and fairly militant leader as far as U.S. trade unionists go, he was in favor of the machine, and he declared the union in favor of, quote, progress. And Dunayevskaya points out that the effect of this was actually to undercut his own political base as membership was quickly decimated. So you see that unions embrace automation at their kind of political detriment. In other cases of automation, and many more recent cases, right, tasks are kind of split off from steady forms of employment and then proliferate throughout societies in other ways. So things like click work or gig work or what media studies scholar Michael Palm calls consumer labor, like telephone dialing and self-checkout. So automation is also a threat to what Cornelius Castoriadis calls the informal organization that prevails in the face of any kind of capitalist organization of work. In the automobile industry, unions welcomed new technologies that they promised would lead to a reduction in working hours. Not only did this not happen, but the technologies ended up affecting the texture and the pace of work to such an extent that workers no longer had recourse to the old rhythms of work that provided them with moments of respite from their drudgery. Pace was accelerated, downtime and breaks eliminated, injuries skyrocketed, and worker autonomy was undermined. And so the response to this was continual worker rebellion, both against their bosses, but also defiance of and a loss of faith in official trade union leadership. Sometimes this led to wildcat strikes, and even in conjunction with radical movements outside the factory wall, revolutionary organizing. But it would also lead, I think, to depoliticization. This is where I'm going to move to something a little something I'm trying to extend from some of the work of the book. I'd argue that following a recent essay by Asad Haider, that depoliticization is still a major strategic problem of our moment, in spite of many encouraging signs to the contrary in the past decade or so. Haider connects this to the historic failures of revolutions in the 20th century, without the appearance of any kind of equivalent egalitarian form in their wake. So perhaps the largest emergent form of contestation in our time is, I don't know if this is a perfect term, but a kind of left populism that is largely contained within bourgeois politics, right? So electoral campaigns to enter the capitalist state, things like Podemos, Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, that are oriented towards reforming neoliberal governance by expanding the welfare state, in many cases restoring a welfare state that's been subject to austerity. While there have been some in my opinion, kind of significant achievements in this approach, it has certainly fallen short of its own goals of definitively breaking with neoliberalism or even solving the problem of depoliticization. These kinds of left electoral challenges stall out at around a third of the electorate and have so far been unable to mobilize significant numbers of non-voters who, theoretically, it's argued, would be attracted to these kind of social democratic programs that are being offered. I think the other major political development in our moment, and again, this is US context, but I think it holds in many other contexts, is anti-police movements. In thinking strictly from the perspective of automated technologies, we have seen some important victories here with the banning of facial recognition technology, which in recognition of both its racist design and the potential for abuse by law enforcement. This, to my knowledge, was not a chief demand of Black Lives Matters or any of the other insurrections, but I do think that attention to the issue would not have happened without such movements. And because police and prison mark the proletariat, particularly of the US, at numerous levels, dismantling these oppressions are a kind of essential task of socialists. So I believe that depoliticization has a technological dimension that is related to automation. And this is not just the degradation and de-skilling of work, the way so many of us feel like and are, in fact, kind of fully replaceable cogs in a machine that is built not for our ends. It is not just the precarity of descending into a growing surplus population as capitalist growth rates slow. I think there's also that's a super important part of the story, don't get me wrong. Aaron's story is absolutely crucial. But there's, I think, also a phenomenological and kind of textural dimension to the automation of work and to everyday life. And in my book, I track resistance to some of these forms, whether it's mundane things like, things like dating apps and self-checkout machines, right? In a somewhat sardonic essay that I really enjoy, Ian Bogos points to the ways that our lives, in the name of convenience, have been surrounded by these sundry forms of automation, from motion sensing hand dryers to auto-corrected text messages to algorithmically determined commutes. Our lives are saturated with automation's opaque and often insufficient mechanisms that require our conformity to their obscure logics. I think this engenders a kind of, and Bogos argues it engenders a kind of passivity, or in the words of philosopher of technology Nolan Gertz, a nihilism, right? That we organize our lives according to our smartphone batteries. They give us a kind of structure, and this structure is a kind of machinic telos, built more often than not on harvesting our user data rather than any kind of real needs or desires that we might have. But there's, of course, like a deeper problem here than just kind of this enemy engendered by the automation of everyday life, which is related to class composition. I once read a socialist writer who was kind of critiquing this idea of do it yourself, right? Because it has this implicit call to take on more and more tasks. And they oppose that with the idea of do it for me, right? This was supposed to be a kind of progressive socialist kind of spin on do it yourself, right? So instead of doing more for ourselves, we should demand that more be done for us. So, and I think this is precisely the promise of a kind of post-work automation. Things will be done for us and it will be the machine that will do it. And I think this is totally the wrong way to go about things, because the promise that technology will do it for us masks the reality that this technology itself is not at all autonomous. So like our deliveries are made by people, not robots, right? And they always promise that there'll be robots one day, but I think we should be skeptical of that. AI systems, right? Even if we feel like they're doing a lot for us, they have to be continually trained by thousands and thousands of human eyes and human clicks. And at the far end, at the far end of the most advanced technological systems are the most degraded forms of human labor. Who promises to do it for us, if not the service sector, that is rapidly being restructured along the lines of the gig economy, dependent on quantitatively eased venture capital on the one hand, and the incredible exploitation of precarious and, in many national contexts, mostly immigrant workers on the other. And this is, maybe a bit cliche, and I'm sure many people know this, but it's worth remembering that the word robot derives from the Czech word for slave. And the robotic imaginary, as described by literary critic Jennifer Rhee, is deeply connected to racialized unfree labor. So I think socialists would make a mistake by hitching their wagon to the continuation of such systems of unsustainable exploitation. And so this goes to the heart of my gambit with Luddism. It's not just that I agree with their perspective on technology, that you should smash the technology that is the kind of instrument of your destruction. It is also that we are no longer in this kind of Fordist moment of composition. And you can, if you check out on kind of left discourse in any corner, you'll notice there's kind of endless nostalgia for the times of Fordism among leftists, right? Which is kind of shocking, right? For stable families, stable borders, stable careers, right? These are Marxists saying this. That might solve the challenges we face today. I think it speaks to kind of actually a real problem, right? That we're facing with composition. So we may be closer to collective bargaining by riot in many of these situations. More generally, I think there's a positive content to Luddism that can inform socialist politics today. Luddism shares with many workers struggles at the point of production and emphasis on autonomy, freedom of conduct, ability to set standards, continuity of working conditions. For the Luddites specifically, new technology was an immediate threat. And so Luddism contains implicitly a kind of critical perspective on technology that examines its relationship to the labor process and working conditions. And therefore, technology is a site of struggle. Luddism is also a rejection of production for production's sake and is critical of efficiency, as there are other values at stake in work. I think importantly, and this is where I break from a lot of kind of humanist criticism of automation and new technologies, that they're like, keeping us separate from one another or ruining conversation, et cetera, is it's not built around kind of ethical choices. So Luddism is a kind of, can generalize. It's not an individual moral stance, but it's a set of practices that can proliferate, build, and become a kind of strata for organization. And finally, Luddism is antagonistic. It's the end of capitalist social relations is political. It will come from struggle, and it will not come from factors like superfluity of goods, right? These are values I think need to inform socialist strategy because, as I try to show in my work, they have historically been values of workers in struggle. Autonomy, a critical view of technology, anti-productivism, opposition to efficiency and growth for their own sake, the ability to carry these perspectives into new arenas and organize around them, and ultimately a position that is not reconcilable to what Haider describes as an adjustment to the existing political economic order. I also argue that many of these values are widely held. People are deeply unsatisfied with how Silicon Valley has reorganized the economy and very skeptical of the onboarding of new technologies. And I think there are political potentials there. So also in my book, I attempt to recover intellectuals and moments in movements that I think represent this kind of Luddite tendency that's opposed to a kind of technophilic and producerist side of Marxism, which became orthodoxy in the official workers movement, manifested in sort of trade unions and political parties. One of them that I want to talk a little bit about is William Morris. William Morris believed, as critic Clive Wilmer put it, that, quote, under capitalism, machines were primarily used to increase production, thereby increasing the workers' drudgery. So rather than churn out endless quantities of cheap goods, society should focus on goods quality, which would both reduce workloads while making work itself more interesting. He favored the use of machinery to reduce working hours, but Morris's ideal of socialism was qualitative, consisting of what he called worthy work, which carries with it the hope of pleasure in rest, the hope of pleasure in using what it makes, the hope of pleasure in our daily creative skill. And so Morris differed from many socialists of his day who, kind of advocated increased leisure and rest in the form of reduced working hours. That's it. In his view, this was insufficient. It was not that he subscribed to some kind of work ethic that valued work for its own sake. His position was rooted in an understanding of Marx's dictum that the realm of freedom begins where the realm of necessity ends, and that necessity, quote, will not be finally conquered till our work becomes a part of the pleasure of our lives. So until we find work rewarding. So a fundamental element of this is attractive work with its reliance on the development of skill of the worker, which would allow the laborer to take pleasurable interest in all the details of life. But such attractive work would require dramatic rethinking of machines, among many other things. And in his riposte to the socialist Edward Bellamy, who wrote an early science fiction novel about a luxury communist future, Morris said of Bellamy, he conceives of the change to socialism as taking place without any breakdown of modern life or indeed disturbance of it. I think this is what in the manifesto Marx and Engels call bourgeois socialism, right? You just kind of switch out the rulers and everything else is more or less the same. So I'm attracted to this idea of worthy work because I do not believe we can do away with work. So one sector, this is a bit speculative, but I've been trying to do some work on this, is that seems important to this way of thinking, is care work. All human beings require substantial amounts of care at various points in their lives, no matter what the mode of production is. And capitalism turns this vital work into utterly degraded forms that in turn degrade that care. They're also currently promising to replace this work with automation by filling hospitals and care homes with robots, algorithms, and other forms of technology. And I don't see how this kind of post-work, like sort of robotic nursing homes and hospitals, leads to a desirable world. Surely socialism should stand for treating the ill and infirm with the dignity of human care. Carers have also, I think, been essential to movements, whether we're talking about nurses, who have strong and fairly militant unions in the US. We're talking about kin, family members, right? Or lovers, if you think about ACT UP during the AIDS crisis. And I think this is because to do their job well and to take pleasurable interest in it requires recognizing the interdependence that capitalism would prefer we ignore or disavow. And relieving the burdens of care work could mean supporting this work by spreading it more widely throughout society, as tends to be done in less advanced forms of capitalism, and more equitably, which it admittedly seldom has been, right? So recognizing and defending worthy work, I think, is also a means to compose the class, to develop autonomous organization without it being continually undermined by technological disruption, and to perhaps direct the economy to other purposes other than ecologically unsustainable growth. All right. And I will also pass the mic.
Thank you so much. So our final speaker is Jason.
Hi, thanks for having me. And I hope I'll be relatively brief. I just want to talk a little bit about the writing I've done around the question of automation. It's really two sort of distinct bits of writing. One is a kind of two-part article that I wrote in the Brooklyn Rail a few years ago, and then my more recent book, which is a little bit different, both in terms of what it treats, but also my own sort of position on the question, or the kind of broad complex of questions. So I'll try my best to sort of, like, in a kind of cursory way, sketch out some of the ideas that I was putting forth there. So the first is that I really sort of see the work that I've done as a kind of polemic against what I would call sort of the rhetoric of imminent automation that began in the early 2010s, or the 2010s, which was really happening in the midst of what I would characterize as a protracted capitalist crisis. So for me, it's, I think Aaron also uses the word automation discourse. I think that's really about right, although I think the term rhetoric might also capture another dimension of this discourse, which was in large part a kind of promotional discourse, as much as it was an attempt to come to terms with some broader social and economic phenomena. Now, this crisis for me was defined not as a financial crisis, but first and foremost as what I would call a crisis of productivity. And by that, I mean a crisis which is not simply a kind of short-term or cyclical crisis of productivity, but a long-term tendency in the advanced industrial economies for labor productivity gains to decrease or to dwindle. And this is a process that's sort of unfolding over the course of, again, not a decade or a kind of cyclical period, but over the course of really about 3, 4, or maybe 5 decades. I really date the origin of this tendency, the origin of this crisis of productivity, to the 1970s. And I think that I do that alongside a host of other writers and observers as well. Now, I think that it's important to realize that, by speaking of a crisis of productivity, I'm by no means sort of developing some kind of novel account of what's happening in the advanced economies, the advanced industrial economies. Since the 1980s, so that's maybe 3.5 decades at this point, late 80s, observers, economists, pundits, the political class, and so on, have spoken of what they called a productivity paradox. And that productivity paradox, as many of you know, is that one sees computers, quote unquote, everywhere but in the labor productivity statistics. So there's this fundamental kind of paradox that's sort of structuring, in some sense, or sort of creating the framework within which we can think about a kind of crisis, which is not a cyclical one, but a secular one. And so that's really the kind of broad context for the kind of writing that I've been doing around automation. Now, the other kind of element of this sort of crisis of productivity, I think, or maybe the key one in some sense for thinking about class struggle, and maybe even socialist strategy, is that there's some kind of relationship that has to be sort of thought through between this decline in labor productivity gains and an equally secular tendency towards wage stagnation. So this correlation between declining productivity gains and labor productivity gains and wage stagnation is something that is observed often by writers on these questions, but the exact relationship between and the implications for this correlation is something that I think I try to develop in what I hope are kind of interesting ways. Now, one of the reasons why this relationship between productivity gains and wage gains is so important is that in a certain sense, we have to think of the post-war gains of the gains of the post-war labor movement, both in the US and in Europe, as having taken place primarily in the context of a kind of extraordinary and even exceptional quarter-century period of gains in labor productivity. And the statistics that are really, really astonishing when you look at them, particularly in Europe and in Japan. And so in some sense, the successes of the labor movement in the post-war period in the advanced economies, industrial economies, really were tied to these kind of very, very exceptional, in some sense, gains in labor productivity. And as many of you know, often in terms of the relationship between the kind of, there were kind of very explicit relationships or correlations at the level of bargaining between capital and labor, between productivity gains and wage gains. So in some sense, wage gains were oftentimes tied to productivity gains. And this is something that historians of the period could describe in great detail, better detail than I could. So I guess to sort of end this kind of initial sort of set of observations, there's also the question of what is the relationship between the decline of the labor movement beginning in the late 70s and maybe early 80s and these other crises that I'm pointing to, particularly the crisis of productivity and its relationship to wage stagnation. Because if indeed the gains of the great sort of kind of golden age of the US and European labor movements are this kind of post-war period in which we saw such extraordinary gains in labor productivity, then in some sense, the decline of the labor movement itself could be seen as being tied in some kind of enigmatic way that has to be sort of worked through to this crisis of productivity itself. So, and this is an important question because in some sense, it sort of poses the question of what would the material conditions need to be for there to be a reemergence or rebirth of the labor movement in its classical form, which many people on the left are quite, the prospect of which many people on the left are quite excited about. Now, again, I want to come back to this question of a polemic, because in some sense it has two parts, and it's not simply a polemic against the kind of Silicon Valley discourse or the discourse of the political class, but it's also a polemic against a certain tendency on the left itself. And I'll cite two really interesting books, actually, really thoughtful and intelligent books that I have in mind. One is Peter Frase's book, which is a really brilliant book in a lot of ways, sort of imagining a kind of fully automated future and the different kind of, it's almost like a combinatory account of different scenarios that could play out with the onset of a kind of radical and broad automation of essentially the service sector in the advanced economies. But also Paul Mason's book, Post-Capitalism, which again was a book that I think was really important for me in thinking about how this rhetoric of imminent automation has been absorbed by or integrated into leftist discourses on broader social and economic questions and analyses. Now, this being said, the question, the feature of this sort of automation rhetoric that I sort of wanted to underline in this one half of the polemical thrust of the book is that they tend to argue that this imminent wave of automation will result in what they call mass unemployment. And I think this term has to really, really be examined more closely than I think often the writers who use this term do. I would point out that in the 1950s, if you look at Friedrich Pollock's book on automation, which was published in 55 or 56, and which is really, really rich in its kind of culling of various kinds of counts of the actual process of automation in major industries in the US. And automation discourse, which was shared by the political class, by labor unions, by economists and so on. The term mass unemployment is used all the time in that context as well. And so there's a kind of historical perspective, empirical perspective that we could look at to try to think about whether or not dynamic technological change results in mass unemployment. There's also a kind of theoretical examination of that question too, which I try to get into a little bit in my book. But one of the points I wanted to make, and one of the kind of basic polemical gestures I make is to argue that periods of mass unemployment are not those, or mass unemployment as a phenomenon is not something that results from technological dynamism, but rather from depressions, from deep depressions of the sort we saw in the 1930s. And so there's a kind of fundamental sort of inversion of the scenarios which have been played out historically, but which for reasons I go into in the book, also have kind of important theoretical underpinnings. Now, the other polemic I wanted to make, of course, was that not simply that this question of mass unemployment was poorly thought through, but also that in some sense the claims being made by this group of writers and this kind of, again, on the left and in the kind of political class more broadly, is that there are a number of reasons why it's very unlikely we would see a kind of imminent wave of automation that would essentially replace workers across many, many sectors, but primarily in the broad so-called service sector, which makes up, in the US context, but also a lot of Western Europe, makes up about 80% of the workforce. So there are three primary reasons. I mean, there's lots to say about these reasons, but the first reason is these labor processes themselves are hard to automate. And there's been a lot of discussion about this, even amongst those people who are otherwise making claims about this sort of world of brilliant technologies, which is on the near horizon. So that's the first thing. These labor processes are oftentimes very, very hard to automate for a lot of reasons. The second, of course, reason why such a wave is unlikely is that labor markets are actually flooded with this abundance of cheap labor. And those are conditions which generally, for both theoretical reasons, which are sort of intuitive in some sense, but also for historical reasons that we can verify, these are conditions which tend to discourage automation on the part of employers, because the reasons that would compel employers to invest in plant and equipment aren't there when labor is cheap and abundant. But the third term, and this is connected, but the third reason why we're unlikely to see this kind of automation wave is that since the turn of the century in particular, and especially since 2008, we've seen in the US in particular, a pronounced decline in the rate of business investment. And that's a really, really key sort of indicator for what the trajectory of the economy as a whole is. And I think this is a phenomenon which no one really debates, right? This is data that's easily available. And so in some sense, at this level of my discussion, I think that there's a broad consensus about some of these sort of obstacles to automation. Now, the question is, for me, however, why do we see these prevailing conditions of low productivity, wage stagnation, and declining business investment? And I think that to really answer these questions, we have to kind of shift our conceptual framework away from the kind of conventional or mainstream economic categories to ones that might actually allow us to sort of grasp a kind of deeper dynamic within the economy. So the first one, the first sort of shift in conceptual framework would be one which sort of recasts the distinction between manufacturing and services, and in particular would criticize the notion of the service of services and the service sector more broadly. Okay, so oftentimes when we talk about declining gains in labor productivity, we talk about that in the context of deindustrialization, which means primarily that larger and larger numbers of workers are being displaced from the industrial or manufacturing sector to the service sector. And it's sort of understood that the service sector is one thing, when in fact you can find that if with any scrutiny whatsoever, that it's in fact an incredibly heterogeneous and massively fragmented sector that has to be sort of pulled apart and sort of rethought in from top to bottom. Now, for me, and I think this is the real kind of theoretical core of my own account, fundamentally, it seems necessary to shift our perspective away from the distinction between manufacturing and services and to recast that distinction and the broader discussion of a kind of crisis or productivity in Marxist terms. And what that means ultimately is that productivity must be understood as, or productive activities must be understood as activities that have produced value in the strict Marxian sense of the term. And that the primary distinction that we need to really understand why we are sort of enveloped in a context defined by low productivity, wage stagnation, and declining business investment is that we need to really make a distinction between value producing activities and unproductive activities in the economy. And this is a distinction which is very, very old, as many of you know, but which is not used very, very often in mainstream economics at this point. So in some sense, the theoretical work, and it's a very difficult abstract level of discourse too, because it's not always so easy to identify this activity as value producing and this activity as unproductive. So it's a kind of highly abstract conceptual or categorical distinction, which then cuts across many occupations, many sectors, and so on and so forth. Now, and I'll try to hurry up here to sort of come to some conclusions. So many service sector activities, of course, are not unproductive activities. And that's the most important thing to understand, I think, in thinking about this conceptual shift. But it is important to understand or to think or to characterize a large number of service sector activities as being what Marx would call circulation or distribution activities. In that sense, they are unproductive activities. And the broader tendency within this process of so-called deindustrialization, which is a useful term in a certain context, is that what we see, and I'm sort of borrowing a little bit from writers like Fred Mosley, but also Paul Maddock, what we see in the contemporary economy is a kind of rising ratio of unproductive to productive laboring activities within the broader economy. And this is a kind of big claim, and it's not easy to verify empirically, even despite Fred Mosley's kind of admirable efforts to do so. But if you assume, for reasons of argument, that that's in fact one of the fundamental dynamics of the contemporary economy, this rising ratio of unproductive to productive laboring activities, then you can start to think through this broader question of crisis and stagnation in a different way than I think that we often hear in the automation discourse or even amongst leftist writers as well. So fundamentally what's at stake in sort of insisting on this distinction between productive and unproductive labor and the rising ratio of unproductive to productive activities is that dynamic introduces a kind of downward pressure on the tendency, on the profit rate. So if you think about the crisis as a crisis of productivity, and you begin to sort of unpack what exactly is at stake in sort of formulating the analysis of this crisis in those terms, you end up in a kind of very classical Marxist analysis, which tends to think through this broad and secular crisis that I'm trying to describe through this idea of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Now, importantly, and this is I think a key moment of the analysis, this downward pressure on the profit rate manifests itself often in the kind of restrictions it places on the ability of businesses to invest in plant and equipment. Okay, so there's this fundamental relationship between this crisis tendency, the rate of profit to fall, and this much more visible phenomenon of the economy, that is to say, the declining rate of business investment. So quickly, I'll just try to summarize some points about how this analysis sort of opens on to the question of class struggle. The first thing I wanted to point out is that where automation seems to be taking place in workplaces, and it's very, very uneven, and it's quite marginal in a lot of cases, but certain sectors, of course, and certain workplaces are much more exposed to the introduction of automation than others. Where it tends to be happening, it often takes the form of the automation of supervisory labor. That is to say, not the labor that's primarily devoted to the control of the labor process, the monitoring, surveillance, and control of the labor process itself. And so the effect here is one of an intensification to labor process. And this is a kind of interesting way to think about the idea of how automation works in the contemporary economy. Second is that wage stagnation, which again is a phenomenon that everyone both experiences but also acknowledges, should be seen in light of this declining labor productivity, such as I've described it, and not simply as a result of the defeat of the labor movement, a political defeat, let's say, of the labor movement. Indeed, the decline of the labor movement itself can be understood as the result of the eroding conditions, material conditions, that in the 1950s were the key to its success, i.e. the correlation between productivity gains and wage gains. Now, finally, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of deindustrialization and the way deindustrialization affects, as a kind of process, the material conditions for the prospect of a reemergence of the labor movement. So first of all, one of the things that's interesting about the notion of deindustrialization, to use this term, which again, I criticize in another context, is that deindustrialization reverses some of the tendencies that made possible the great, powerful classical labor movement. First of all, because it tends less and less to concentrate labor in massive workplaces with enormous masses of capital to valorize. That's one of the fundamental tendencies of the industrialization, is this kind of concentration of labor in huge workplaces with enormous masses of capital. Instead, what you see is something like a dispersion of workers into smaller and smaller workplaces with less and less capital intensity. Secondly, one of the important features of this deindustrialization process is that there's no real convergence of labor processes across industries. One of the great things about the industrialization process for the fate of the labor movement is that because they were using similar production technologies and techniques in different industries, steel, chemicals, automobiles, and so on and so forth, what you saw was a kind of convergence across sectors of labor processes and skill levels, and therefore wage levels. And so there was a kind of unifying tendency within the labor movement as a whole across sectors that was tied in some sense to these changes in the production process. So instead, I think, again, there's instead of that kind of unifying tendency, what we see is a kind of fragmentation across labor markets and across the class as a whole. Smaller workplaces, less capital intensity, divergence of labor processes and skills. And that tendency, that kind of dispersive tendency, is one that kind of undermines the prospects and the project of rebuilding a labor movement along the lines of, say, the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And then finally, again, I'm going a little over time here, but let me be quick here. So for the reasons that I just sort of laid out, I think that the broad rebirth of the labor movement in its classical form is one that would require reversing some of these tendencies that I think are in some sense irrevocable and irreversible. And it would depend in some sense on a new and kind of secular uptrend marked above all by an explosion in labor productivity. And I'm skeptical of that possibility. Nevertheless, I think that it's important to underline that in the very decade in which this kind of crisis of productivity has been so pronounced, since 2008, we've seen kind of, in certainly the US, impressive mobilizations of teachers in particular, who are, of course, usually public sector unionized workers who are less exposed to the threat of automation than other sectors, for example, logistics. And the success of these mobilizations are often due to the place of teachers and the social division of labor. So that's one key factor to sort of consider when thinking about the relationship between ongoing stagnation and crisis of productivity and mobilization of workers. And the last point to make is that in France, on the other hand, we saw a very different kind of revolt recently. And it's among workers who can be described as living in the kind of outer regions of large cities usually. And these tended to be workers who are oftentimes low-wage circulation workers, not unionized, and oftentimes newly politicized, people who've never been mobilized as workers in their lives. And these workers, as we saw, this is the Gilets jaunes movement I'm talking about, tended not to have access to traditional forms of workplace action and tended to organize themselves outside the workplace, but as workers. And that gave rise to all incredibly interesting and novel forms of struggle that weren't necessarily successful in any sort of conventional measurement, but nevertheless pose a kind of question as to what the future of class struggle might look like in changing conditions, which most likely won't give rise to a kind of new, robust labor movement in its classical form. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jason. And thank you, Gavin and Aaron, for these fantastic talks. I think at this point, we'd like to shift to conversation, questions, comments. So if you have a question, it would be easiest for me rather than if you put a raised hand, because there are 130 people in this video. If you could drop your intention to speak in the chat, that would be very helpful to me. So I know we had a first request from Russell Dale with a question or a comment. And then after that, Connor.
Hi, everybody. Well, thank you. Those are really excellent talks, and I really benefited from your thoughts about these different things. I'll try to be very brief. I want to ask about three things, which really all of you have hit on, but I just sort of would like to dig a little deeper into it. The first one is just, there's basically in the world today a racial division of labor, where much of the mining and the whole technological world that the US sort of fantasizes is going to turn into a post-scarcity technological utopia, or at least many of the white middle class and such people think in these terms. It depends on people of color, Black people in Africa digging coltan, lithium, cobalt, etc., like copper. You know, these things are still dug in mostly unautomated, non-automated manual labor. And some of you mentioned this idea that if you throwing people out of work or people don't have any jobs, it kind of diverts any capital from coming in there to develop automation in those areas. So you have an abundance of cheap labor. There's never been much of a movement to try to automate coltan digging in Kivu province in Congo, or southern Congo for, and similarly in Bolivia for lithium. So what is the fantasy here? That there's going to be a world of no labor. It's still going to be Black people and people of color who are digging up all of the materials that you need to make the computers that are going to run the post. Can somebody comment about how that is supposed to work in this fantasy of a post-scarcity? People imagine, because in the United States, maybe there's less and less industrial jobs or something, but what about the rest of the world that the computerized world depends on? Okay, that's point one. Point two is just a simple question. Productivity is dropping. I'm sure there's some technical way of understanding that. Could you explain that? Because in 1968, gross domestic product in the United States was $1 trillion in today's dollars, roughly. It was $970 billion. But today it's 21 trillion. So it looks like productivity is huge. And the way you sort of intuitively explain that is computers have entered, computerization have entered production process and have made production increases. Are you talking about something extremely recent, that productivity is in a crisis and it's going down? Because it doesn't look like it's going down empirically. And the third thing I wanted to ask about is this idea that there's not been very much business investment since 2000, which especially Jason was talking about. Can you explain what that means? I mean, it seems like the stock market is really huge today. How is business investment? What do you mean by business investment is going down? Can you explain that? Okay, that's it. I'm done.
Do you guys want to jump in if you have a response?
If it's okay, I'll go ahead and respond to or try to talk about the first point there. Well, I think the simplest explanation is you've identified like an incredible blind spot to a lot of pro-automation discourse, which really does not consider it at all, or considers it very superficially. I think one kind of, I mean, there are, I think, some interesting kind of Marxist works. I think George Kafensis tries to kind of solve this. I think I don't know if it quite works. It's like a bit too neat and mechanical, right? But he looks at like these like high-tech, high organic concentration of capital industries and says there's almost a necessity for like a sort of low productivity kind of component on the other end, right? He has this neat little cone almost that sticks in my mind. It's like on the one end the computer, on the other end the slave, and that's like a consistent feature. It's George Kafensis. He was part of Midnight Notes, Silvio Federici's partner, I believe. I think I don't remember the essay that comes from. So yeah, I think you point right. This is actually like I think a feature of this kind of style of production. And then I think if you want to think about what would it mean to have a different kind of how would you address these kinds of things, right? I mean, this is why I think taking it to the level of politicizing the technology itself is like very important. There are some movements, actually, some initiatives. I don't know if you want to raise them to the level of movements, but that I think are promising, or at least posing the question in a way I think is useful, which is like, well, is things that are looking at like we need to. The devices currently are constructed in a way that requires new minerals all the time. They're designed to expire, right? This is a long, this sort of this is a long-term kind of dynamic, right? You know, cars were the same way, right? You have to buy a new one every year, every couple of years, or you're supposed to, or something like that. So there are movements, right, that are trying to at the level of like government policy. To force companies to make devices that are easier to repair, to allow them to be repaired by people, to make them modular in a way that you wouldn't have to replace the entire thing. You could replace components. But I think that, I don't know if that's going to actually solve the problem, but it is actually something like those folks actually understand the supply chains. So I think that's at least a step in the right direction. But yeah, I think we might have to ask a question of like, what kind of production, if we were going to live in a kind of globally egalitarian world, what kind of production would it take? Maybe we wouldn't have, maybe some of these devices, right, would be sacrificed. Maybe the production of them is unsustainable or wouldn't meet the kind of values that we would have in such a society. So yeah, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, maybe I'll just say a couple things. I mean, certainly about the rate of business investment. I mean, I think that these are data that are totally, like available to anyone who's interested in sort of finding them. These are it's widely recognized to be a kind of feature of the advanced economy since 2000. I think that this kind of disconnection between the rate of business investment and the kind of booming stock market is itself one of the phenomena that have to be sort of examined and sort of thought through. I think there's actually a kind of interesting correlation between them. But I think that, when you look at what the stock market boom has actually been over the last, since the last decade, let's say, it's usually just a few companies that are driving this boom, right? And they tend to be thought of as being tech companies. And those tech companies themselves could be scrutinized in terms of thinking about whether or not what they do is technology, or whether they're internet companies and that sort of thing. But oftentimes the share price is driven up by sort of accounting maneuvers and kind of tricky investment processes, which have very little to do with investment in so-called plant and equipment, that is to say, expanding production. But instead you have things like share buybacks, or recently I think that the data has in sort of measuring the rate of business investment has shifted so that you can characterize, for example, the sort of legal activities required to make technologies proprietary as a form of business investment. Or, for example, mergers and acquisitions can sometimes be characterized as forms of business investment, when in fact that's not what they are understood in kind of classical terms. And so the great irony, of course, is that these tech companies that are so kind of preponderant, both in terms of our everyday life, but also in terms of the sort of the kind of glories of the booming stock market, tend to actually invest very little of their revenue in sort of technology and in expanding production. And that's one of the great ironies of them. They're quite stagnant companies in a lot of ways, and they depend in certain cases on monopoly-like conditions, which tend to be sort of connected to or dependent on the kind of network effects that come along with things like social media and that sort of thing. And of course, everyone knows that most of the revenue of Google and Facebook and companies like that tends to be derived from advertising, which is a very old, century-old sort of, at least, kind of sort of feature of, sort of consumer-oriented economies. And so that's one thing to point out. I mean, the other things in terms of productivity, and maybe Aaron would have more interesting things to say about this than I would just simply point out that in the post-war period in Japan, for example, there was a quarter century of productivity gains at 10% annually. So there were annual, 10% gains over the course of a quarter century. And to think about, if you look at the same statistics now in Japan since the 90s, you're going to see something very, very different. And so I think that the question is the decline in labor productivity growth relative to the post-war period. And I think the numbers look like, with the exception of the 1990s, when you had a kind of small uptick in labor productivity gains, the numbers really since the 70s and into the present moment tend to be around 1-2%. I mean, it's a very, very sort of minimal gains. And there are lots of reasons why that could be the case, including this kind of massive transfer of the working population from the manufacturing to the so-called service sector, which tends to be low productivity and less capital intensive. But these are phenomena that again, capitalists sort of observers wring their hands about all the time. I mean, the Bank of England, like every month during the last 10 years, I think it was under Mark Carney, was putting out papers about why does England suffer so greatly from this so-called productivity paradox. So I would just sort of underline those responses to your question. Like,
and I think those are great answers. And just in the interest of time, I'll, pass my turn.
All right, thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do 4 questions now. I'm going to read 2 from the chat, and then after I'm done with those, Connor and Mark, if you would like to unmute and read your questions in that order. So the first question I'm going to read is from David Schwartzman. He said, to all panelists, please put your arguments in the context of the climate crisis and a global Green Deal, which would increase the demand for labor and potentially its transnational power challenging global capital. Next from MP, I found Aaron's book really useful and really interesting, but I'm thinking back to Pashtone's comment about how Brenner's analysis of overcapacity and increased competition is limited to a surface level understanding, rather than engaging with categories of the critique of political economy or deep structure, as Pashtone puts it, such as value, commodity, and capital. Jason Smith's book, on the other hand, places value in the rise of unproductive labor as central to the understanding of the current crisis. I was hoping if Jason Smith and Aaron could talk about different approaches they take and how those relate to understanding not only economic crises, but also abstract social mediation. I have a question for Aaron. Do you think that physicalist planning, which is necessarily going to maximize social surplus, could lead to similar imperatives to value production? And do you think that would constrain the realm of freedom? Actually, maybe we'll just do those two, and then I realize that's quite long. So maybe we'll just do those two, and then we can go back to the people who'd like to say their questions.
Okay, well, I think that, so the first question about the climate crisis, I think it's, obviously this is the big question of our moment. And I think it's very interesting that there are a variety of different kinds of radical Keynesian and more kind of Marxist views on the potentials of a Green New Deal, and also what the Green New Deal, will actually consist of. Like, will it consist of a series of kind of incentives to private investment? Will it look like a real shift in the character of state activity today towards a kind of public investment-led transformation in our basic infrastructure? Or, will it only really be possible for any of this to happen with a massive social movement and struggle? And I think, it's very, we could talk about that all day, for sure. I think that one issue with the Green New Deal as it's presented is that it kind of overestimates the extent to which, especially globally, that investment could really solve the problem of the underdemand for labor on the world scale. Estimates by the ILO and Robert Pollin even up these to some extent are on the order of tens of millions of jobs, or even 100 million jobs. But it's worth noting that on the global scale, there are about 3.2 or so billion workers in the world, and about 65% of those are informal. So that's about 2 billion people. So on the whole, I think the Green New Deal as a kind of world transforming strategy for bringing us back to an era of growth, it just can't create enough growth to actually push us back towards full employment or create that as a possibility on the world scale. It's much more likely, as other people have said, that if it's just a kind of strategy that maintains our society as it is, but seeks to transform the infrastructure towards renewable energy, that it will really be a program for the global north, and that it will be a kind of eco-apartheid type of thing. And that's a really dangerous and scary prospect. I don't think it's necessary, however. I do think that, again, thinking about these things not merely as technological questions, but social ones, it is the case, as many, many analysts have shown, that we can meet everyone's needs at a high level, and more through collective provision of goods rather than, so for example, through public transportation, rather than trying to make electric cars for everyone. As Russell said, there just isn't enough mining resources to make something like that possible. There are solutions like that. There are more radical solutions that meet everyone's needs and remain within planetary boundaries, but it would require that people have access to goods not through wage labor and through a radical transformation of the society and social structures that we live in. And I'll just say that, there's a huge literature on this, and there's many more people talking about it. So maybe I'll just stop there on that. On the Brenner postone question, so Moish was actually my advisor as an undergrad, and he had a major influence on my thinking around all of these questions. I think that the analysis that Brenner gives of the post-war era really shows how rapid growth is politically neutralizing in a lot of ways. It is a way of incorporating working class demands into capitalism, although in a limited sense, obviously, it's much more of a promise than a reality of transformation. And I think in ways that Gavin stressed, it also required workers giving up a lot of shop floor control and kind of subjecting themselves to highly alienating and dissatisfying forms of work. And I think that, when we hit this point of overproduction, overcapacity, and the system started to slow down, that revealed, some of basically the features of the Marxian critique that Postone emphasized really come into their own in that kind of long downturn moment. And I guess that my difference from Moish, though not really from his later work, where I think he did emphasize this more, is that in his work, he tended to underemphasize the role of those crisis tendencies in Marx's own thought, and the way that those crisis tendencies made what he called the ought of, but Moish talks about the contradiction between what is and what ought to be. And what ought to be in his analysis is, an expanded realm of freedom and so on. But in the world, these long-term stagnation crisis tendencies of capitalism make the ought of expanded freedom into the reality of underemployment, mass insecurity for workers, and rising inequality. And so I don't think that those accounts are so deeply in tension. I do think that, on the other hand, there are a lot of issues with, as it were, Bob Brenner's long downturn analysis, and I've tried to supplement that by looking at specific features of the service sector and using, as some other people commented in the chat, Baumol's cost disease theory to kind of extend that analysis. And I think also that, in a lot of ways, Bob seemed to think that, over time, the kind of wipeout of existing capital bases would recreate the conditions for a boom. And I think that not only for ecological reasons, but also economic ones, that boom is very unlikely to happen. I do think that, if we do move into an era of high levels of state-led public investment, that's going to change the game in really interesting ways. Though I think, that's also a whole other conversation. As far as physicalist production, I'm not sure I totally followed what the question is, but definitely I think that in my book, I didn't pay enough attention or think through enough what it would actually take to create a post-scarcity world through transforming social relationships rather than merely relying on technologies. And the work I've done on the socialist calculation debate in that Logic article, and then after that, I see that as an extension and working out of some of those issues. It's definitely the case that we're going to have to work. And as Gavin emphasized, we're also going to want to make the work that we do more satisfying, especially if we're going to live in a world where people have all of their needs met, as it were, without question. We're going to have to transform the realm of necessity so that people actually find that work inherently or intrinsically satisfying to do. And that means radically transforming what that work looks like. So I will just stop there and pass the mic.
I just have a brief comment on the ecology question. I think I was watching a talk by Andreas Malm, and he says that in his estimation, the big problem of the ecological movement today is it lacks antagonism. So programs that are sort of reliant on sort of massive state spending are I think of a piece with what I describe as depoliticization, right? So I think that, what I'm trying to do is kind of reconjure, right, a kind of antagonism, that's a sort of grassroots antagonism to capitalist social relations and the state that enforces it. And so I see that as quite consonant with some of the things that Malm is discussing in his analysis of ecological movements today, where he's talking about, I'm talking about breaking things at work. He's talking about blowing up pipelines. I think there's a lot of there's some resonance to that, right? I mean, we're not advocating property destruction for its own sake. But the idea that one thing that's sort of missing from a lot of these movements is a kind of autonomy that derives from a sort of antagonism to the state, rather than appealing to the state to solve the problems that we face. Because I don't personally think I don't have personally have a lot of faith in that. So yeah, I'll just leave it there.
And I think that maybe I'll just pass in the interest of time.
All right. So I just want to point out we are 10 minutes over the time already, and there are so many fabulous questions sitting in the chat. Maybe what I'd like to do is the two, Connor and Mark, if you'd like to pose your questions, and then if our speakers, would you like to look in the chat and see if there are any questions there that you would like to answer after those two, and then maybe we can wrap up after that, if that sounds good. So
thank you,
Connor. Oh yeah, go ahead. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting, and thanks to the speakers. I have so many questions. I'll just ask one because there's not much time. Okay, so basically what I want to ask is, I think that there is a certain kind of one-sidedness to all of the books that the three of you have written. And I say this just brief caveat, I'm highly sympathetic to the project that I think you're all kind of engaged in, but I just have a critical comment in this for the purposes of trying to kind of advance things. So I think there's a one-sidedness, namely, I think there's a certain kind of basically negative attitude to technology. And then I think it's related to another gap, which is a kind of an uncritical attitude to both two concepts, one of that of work and the other that of technology. I think that this makes sense in light of who you're arguing against, but I would sort of like to ask the question of, isn't it the case that perhaps we need to be looking back to some of the kinds of politics that were available in the 70s, where we have a more kind of dialectical, transformational attitude to like a politics of technology? So the recovery of Luddism is a recovery of a politics of technology, but it seems to me the way Gavin has presented it, it's largely a kind of negative one, where technology is understood as machineries of expansion of exploitation and oppression. And I think that Aaron kind of pays lip service to the idea that the automation theorists are valuable because of their utopian kind of desires. But I think actually it's notable that you kind of mischaracterize some left automation theorists like Cernchik and Williams, who are very clearly saying not that automation is imminently transforming work out of existence in our world, but rather that it precisely isn't doing that. It's producing that surplus populations exist for other reasons, and that we need to make automation a political demand because capitalism isn't imminently automating everything away. So I think it's kind of interesting that that mischaracterization exists, and I think it is related to this idea of that we don't yet have a kind of radical transformative politics of technology where we think of technology as imminently capitalist, but also transformable, and also where we think that the problem of how we actually transform the mode of production the kind of force of production that actually exists in our world into something else has to be answered concretely. I think people in the 70s, like Huey Newton, for example, had a much more ambitious kind of sense of the possibilities opened up by technology. I think some of the left automation theorists are keen on bringing that back, and I think that they themselves do it in a very one-sided way. But I think that there's some kind of synthesis that needs to be gotten at here, and I'm interested in whether you guys agree with me on that and whether you've thought about how that might come about.
I'll jump in. Yeah, it's a good question. I think I am interested in those things. I think you're right that the 1970s are very interested, and it's actually something I've started looking into. There's is kind of alternative forms of technology. I think the problem, right, or the thing I'm trying to extricate myself from is, it doesn't seem like there's been too much of that, at least in my lifetime. Capital has really been in the driver's seat. Although I do talk quite a bit about open source and free software, not because I think that is necessarily in and of itself like a sort of anti-capitalism, but because the movements associated with that technology were quite effective at preserving working conditions for people that prevail to this moment. So I think I think those are the things I'm trying to put together, is not just to kind of evaluate various technologies as like sort of good or bad and should we oppose them, but like what is the bigger problem, right, to solve is how do you create a kind of an effective anti-capitalist political movement, and what technologies have seemed to what's the relationship of technology that seems to kind of encourage some of that kind of thing. So I think I talk a little bit about kind of hacker culture and sort of, because I think hackers are actually Luddites in many cases and develop technologies in kind of Luddite ways, in that they are trying to kind of preserve sort of more egalitarian kind of working conditions, they're democratizing the spread of knowledge and things like that. There's also some other kind of interesting things that I've started looking into. Maybe you know of this, is a magazine called Low Tech Magazine, which specializes in like looking at precisely this, and especially technologies that are also developed in sort of non-Western and non-industrial contexts that can actually achieve the things that we need to do to live and to do other kinds of enjoyable things. But I agree with you that it's a very interesting question, and one that I'm looking into more deeply, right?
I guess if we're responding, I think that's a really interesting point. I don't really agree with you on the not you, Gavin, but you, Connor, on the inventing the future question, because I think that they, like a lot of the other authors in that genre, sort of suppose that automation basically is technically possible, and that the existence of a lot of low-wage labor is just blocking that technical possibility from happening, so that the political demand is for a imminently realizable technological shift that they do look for evidence of in the economy today, that it could actually be realized. And I don't think that analysis is correct. And I think that there are even real strong technological limits to the achievement of automation, which ultimately just depends on artificial intelligence being possible, that you can put brains behind the machines. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that we're just really far from achieving that, and that the political demand for automation will be as ineffective as the investors' demand for automation. So I think that that's an issue. I don't think, though, that this account that I give requires in any way that we be anti-technology at all. I think it just says that the solutions to our problems are first and foremost social solutions. And I actually do think that, and I've written about this again in other venues, but I think it's really important that automation as a socialist strategy, part of why it's so appealing is that it seems to mean that we don't really have to plan anything. It seems to provide the possibility that all of the human conflicts and problems of motivation and discovery and implementation of innovations can simply be solved by putting them in the hands of computers rather than people. And that it's really a frustration with that, and a kind of failure to really think through what happened in the 20th century and what the lessons of the USSR and the failures of those projects and the possibilities of planning for the future are. I think that those are really serious social and political questions. And technologies are going to be part of the solutions. I actually think digital technologies are obviously going to make it much easier to plan. And they are definitely, whatever technologies we've achieved can be used in ways that would make a post-scarcity, post-capitalist world much more enjoyable. But I do think that within that world, sort of putting one's hopes in AI and automation kind of stands in for a reticence to really think through the problems of planning, which have to be solved, as it were, at a social and political level, and can't merely be we can't solve them with technologies. So that's, I don't know. I think, though, it's a really interesting debate, and I've learned a lot from all of the different kinds of algorithmic and automation-based accounts, especially from the more utopian dimensions of their work. And I'm definitely excited to continue that conversation. So I'm just, I say all that in a comradely way, if it's possible.
I just wanted to make one point about the this idea of returning to some of the debates of the 1970s, because in some sense I'm very sympathetic to that as well. But I did have a few thoughts about that. I mean, first of all, the fact that the broader kind of social and economic context and the kind of material situation is so dramatically transformed since the 1970s, and that much of the discourse in the late 60s and 70s around automation was really formulated in the context of this kind of really exceptional historical situation, which was marked, of course, by automation of core industrial sectors in the US and elsewhere. And so in some sense, we have to kind of think about how it is that people in the 70s arrived at those positions and what was the kind of context, as opposed to, let's say, 40, 50 years later. The other thing that I wanted to say about the debates in the 70s, though, is that you have, in particular in the feminist movement, you have these really, really interesting and kind of highly politicized discussions about automation that are taking place. And maybe the most interesting ones are in that context. And I was thinking in particular of someone like Angela Davis, who wrote a very famous article, late 70s, I think maybe 1980, that essentially formulates this demand for the automation of domestic or unwaged labor. And in many ways, Davis's article it's worth revisiting. And what I found when I was rereading it not long ago is that in some sense, it's a kind of recapitulation in a slightly new context of a kind of long-standing demand within the socialist movement for a kind of demand, for an automation or mechanization and collectivization of domestic labor. But you also have in Italy these kind of much more, a very different kind of unorthodox perspectives on this question that sort of challenge that kind of fundamental kind of, 80 years long kind of tradition of a kind of simple demand to mechanize domestic labor. And so in some sense, that would be a kind of debate worth returning to, I think, in the broader context of a kind of tendency toward a service sector, quote unquote, that is polarized around questions of caring labor and so on and so forth, and how those kinds of debates could be sort of revisited in the contemporary context. I don't know if that reflects on some of the books that you referred to or the discourse you referred to, but that's one thing I think that I, in the context of my book at least, don't actually address in a kind of way that's, I think, is adequate. There's some footnotes and some passages, but I do think those are the debates that might be interesting to revisit specifically.
Great. And so maybe in the interest of time, if each of the panelists, was there anything you saw in the chat that you'd like to respond to? And maybe you guys can each go take a moment to look through all of the very interesting questions from
I think there are like 50 of them, right? I mean,
there are a lot. And we're already so over time, almost half an hour over time. So is there anything that you'd like to respond to or say in closing before we end? If you just take a moment to peruse those great comments. Someone says, let's do this again next week. No, I'm taking next Saturday off. Any last, or we can also just.
Yeah, there's a question about the how is bi-POC thought inform my approach to this. I think it has quite a lot. I'm happy that Jason brought up the wonderful kind of feminist science and technology studies scholarship of the 70s and 80s, which I think is basically the gold standard for such analysis. Those debates are incredibly elucidating. But yeah, I think, I talked a little bit, right? I think that a lot of there's a couple of great books on what I refer to as this robotic imaginary, right? The idea that there's these others that do it for you, right? That is like deeply tied to kind of racialized unfree labor. And that in fact, we know from research on how the gig economy and these other forms of sort of quote unquote high tech economies, their relationship to labor unfold, in fact, do consist of highly racialized, extremely exploited forms of labor. So we've mentioned the kind of artisanal, they actually call it this, artisanal mining of coltan in the Congo, but we can also think about how Samasource opened this massive like AI tagging kind of factory really in the slums of Nairobi. So the people who are sort of training autonomous cars live in one of Africa's biggest slums. So to me, that the whole paradigm of automation, and one thing that I think is so important to call attention to, is that it actually does rely on this massive strata of extremely degraded labor, which tends to be through the virtues of digital computer networks, right, can be outsourced to the global south. And even in advanced economies, the gig economy tends to function through by exploiting people who are who are a disproportionate amount of people who are immigrants, right? Who are riding for Deliveroo or and these kinds of things, right? Driving for Uber. So it's absolutely a part of the kind of story I'm trying to tell. I think that if you think about things like I kind of briefly mentioned in relationship to sort of the anti-policing movements, critiques of surveillance, an analysis of how those kind of things unfold. Again, you see that this is a kind of essential point of to consider. I think I don't think I have a lot to add to that. I would just say you need to read people like Simone Brown and Ruha Benjamin and Sophia Noble, who have really done path-breaking work on how a lot of algorithmic systems and sort of these technologies are utterly imbricated with like kind of racialized logics, and it's quite fascinating, right, and important.
Maybe I'll just say, in closing as well, and following on a bit what Gavin said, I know Jason and I, probably Gavin too, are all really interested in the thought of James Boggs, whose book, The American Revolution, Manifesto, Black Revolutionary Party, was one of the most interesting engagements of the 1960s with the theory of automation and the possibilities for a post-capitalist future. And his thought had an immense influence over a lot of Detroit radicals, including in RAM and Drum, and also in the Black Panthers. And whatever critiques we might have of the Black Panthers as a kind of revolutionary strategy, the thought of that era was sort of suffused with Boggs's analysis of automation and of the people that he called, and thinking here really about racialized populations in the United States, the outsiders. So I would just really recommend that his work as a kind of supplement to what we've been saying here. I think also, there's a lot of technical questions in the chat, which would take a very long time to answer. But I think it's really interesting to think about maybe some of the strategic questions and people saying, well, we haven't really answered those questions. And I think that is really important. I think that in a lot of ways, at least the way that I see my work, is less like, I don't think that I have some great insight into strategies for working class organizing. I think that if you want those, then you should look to, working class organizers who are really in the trenches. And you should also look to the kinds of social struggles that are happening in our era, not just in workplaces, but George Floyd rebellion, and really, the range of social movement. 2019 was a year of immense social struggle all around the world. And I think we probably will see more of that in the years to come. I think the role of the work that I do is more trying to explain and justify, in a way, the struggles that are going on, and explain why this is happening, and understand and place those within the moment, and to try to say something about the kinds of communist or utopian or post-scarcity or socialist potentials that are kind of already at work in those struggles, and to kind of think about what it would take for those struggles to push forward towards a post-capitalist world. That's where I put my energies lately, is really into thinking about what are the essential contours of a possible vision of post-scarcity in the contemporary moment we have, facing the ecological crisis, facing the stagnation of our era, and facing the kinds of struggles that are emerging right now. But I think that there's so much stuff to do, right? And the thing to do is to immerse oneself in the struggles that are happening around you, where you are, and to think about the strategic implications of those kinds of struggles and possibilities that are local to your specific situation. So that's why I haven't said anything specifically on the topic of socialist strategy in the talk. I see it more as explaining and trying to justify the struggles, give a reason for the revolt that is happening, rather than tell people what I think they should be doing. So, yeah. But I'll just say in closing, since this will be my last comment, that I really enjoyed the panel. It was really great to talk with you guys. And I'm sorry that we didn't get through even a tiny portion of all of the questions that were in the chat. So thanks again to Kirsten for organizing this, and to Jason and Gavin for doing it with me.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I'll just sort of reiterate some points that have been made before. I totally agree that that Boggs's work is really a key text for understanding really the American situation in the middle of the century and even into the present in a lot of ways, if you can read it in a certain way. A really important figure who, and not so much in the book, but in some earlier texts that I published on automation, played a kind of tutelary role in my thinking. I would also say that I noticed, for example, that there's a couple questions about Baumol in the chat, and I think these are really good questions. And I think that it would be worth. I hope someone will have the opportunity to talk about the way Baumol is mobilized in my text and in Aaron's text as well, and sort of think through the role he plays in these kind of arguments. Because I think that for me, in some sense, my engagement with his work was largely due to discussions with people like Aaron and with Jasper Burns and a few others. And I really spent a lot of time thinking through what exactly I wanted to say about Baumol in particular, and how his argument would play out in the kind of economy of my own argument. So I think it's a kind of interesting place to sort of think about the broader discussion and maybe some of the differences in our accounts. Nevertheless, I think that what's interesting for me and what's exciting for me is that we three, but really a whole sort of hundreds and thousands of people are having these discussions that are kind of centered on a kind of relatively narrow set of questions which seem decisive. And that's something that, at least in terms of theoretical orientation, is important for me. I have very little to say about socialist strategy in this particular context, but I do think that it's something I'm interested in quite a bit and have written about elsewhere, like in the Brooklyn Rail, for example, if people are interested. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks again, Kirsten, for organizing this, and I really want to thank everyone for showing up to this on a Saturday morning for me anyway. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Gavin, Jason, and Aaron. That was so fantastic. And I was so grateful that we were able to provide a platform for this great discussion. Thank you, everyone who showed up. And just one more pitch to please subscribe to Science and Society. Encourage your library to subscribe, and please read these 3 very interesting new books. Thank you very much. Bye.